it is a process that has, I think, a very simple form which we can explain in this way. You start the day with a certain amount of money. You then take that money and you go into a marketplace and you buy a commodity called labor power. And you also buy means of production. Now this can be raw materials, machinery, energy, etc. In other words, a wide range of things that you need to produce. You then choose a technology. So I'm going to put this in brackets here because the technological circumstances under which this occurs is terribly important. And with that technology, you combine means of production and labor power under the control of the capitalist in something called, we'll call, a labor process. The making of things, in which you make a commodity, you make a spectacle, you make a film, or you make whatever. And so the labor process is crucial because that is the working on things. The labor power works on all of these things, and out of this labor process, there comes a commodity. It can be a thing or an event or whatever. And then the problem is the capitalist has this commodity and has to sell it in the market. And so there is here a moment, a process of selling. And this contrasts, of course, with the moment up here of buying. So the capitalist buys at this point and sells at this point, but then sells for the original money, same as up here, plus extra money, which is a profit, which means that somewhere in this system there has to be a surplus. So the big question mark is, where does the surplus come from? That is the big question mark, which is what we call the enigma of capital. Now Marx's answer was that it comes from the labor process. That is, it is the worker who creates the extra value, who adds the value to all of these items and brings them into the new commodity. So the new commodity is impregnated with the surplus value, which is then realized through this process of selling in the market, and it's realized as profit, which is the surplus. So the origin lies there in the labor process. But nevertheless, there is a difficulty down here as to how this surplus is going to be realized in the market. Where is the market demand? And my answer to that, which is different from some other people's, but my answer to that is it's essentially given by IOUs. That is that I buy without actually paying. So buying and then paying on the never-never becomes crucial to how this system works. Now, the temporal dynamic of this, the time dynamic, is very important. That is, this process takes a certain time. Once we get to this point, the question arises, what does the capitalist do next? And at this point, we have some of this comes back and gets reinvested. And we go back through this process all over again. So this is a process we will call a reinvestment process. And this goes on in perpetuity. Now this goes on again and again and again, and this is how capital accumulates over time, because more and more surplus ends up in the hands of the capitalist who is organizing all of this. So this is the flow of capital, which means that this increases at a compound rate. I mean, it's like breeding sheep. You start off with 2, and then you end up with 4, and then you end up with 8, and then you end up with 16, and then you end up with 32, and then you end up with 64. and pretty soon you have a huge flock. This is accumulation at a compound rate of growth. And this is what the capitalist does by this system, by taking some of the surplus and investing it in extra means of production and extra labour power and keeping the system going. So this is the way in which this system works. And there's a very interesting association between the accumulation of wealth and power and capital, which is going on through this process, and the accumulation of IOUs, the accumulation of debt. So the accumulation of wealth and accumulation of capital is paralleled by the accumulation of debt over time. And many people would now argue that we've reached a limit on the accumulation of debt. And one of the things that I then say is, well, if you limit the increase in debt, then actually you're going to limit this the capacity of this system to survive. So that organic relationship between debt accumulation and accumulation of wealth is something very significant in the dynamics of capital, and it's part of what the enigma of capital is about, that people don't really see that relationship and don't think about that relationship. This system is quite vulnerable at a number of different points, and I'd go through them very quickly. The first question is, have you enough money at the outset to do what needs to be done? So this is a potential crisis point, number one, that there's not enough money to do it. The second crisis point is in the labour market. The workers there that you need to create the commodity, and if they're too well organised and not enough of them, there can be a crisis of labour supply. The third is, are there adequate means of production over here, and that often arises with the idea of a crisis in relation to nature, that is, there are not enough raw materials around. Then another point is the technology right? So here's a point of possible disruption because the technology is not available. The labour process is the fifth point of vulnerability. So that can also be a place where things go wrong. Sixth point is this selling. And this really divides into two. Is there a commodity market, and are there debt instruments around to facilitate this passing of IOUs around, that is a banking system and all the rest of it. So we have all of these points of possible crisis. Any one of them can be a blockage in the system, and it's like any system, if the flow is smooth and continuous, everything's great, but if any one of these gets blocked, then the system gets a heart attack. I mean, it's a bit like blood flow suddenly gets stopped at one of these points. Now, what happens is that very frequently there is a crisis at one of these points, and we do something which then generates a crisis somewhere else. So typically the history of crises under capitalism is a sort of zigzagging from one thing to another. That the labour market works out, and then we have a real problem of selling the goods because the workers don't have enough money to buy. And this creates what I call a game of hot potato. That is, the crisis gets moved around. 1 minute it's here, and if you're the money holders, you're holding the bag of the crisis, and you get out of it, and then that creates a crisis in relation to nature, and the speculation on raw materials and not enough energy supplies, and so then you get out of that, and then there's a crisis of selling, which then bounces back to a crisis of labour, so it bounces around all of the time. And the big question is, who is holding the crisis when the big crisis occurs? In other words, what we see is a shuttling back and forth across all of these difficulties and overcoming of them, but at a certain point the whole thing gums up, and then the question is this the main blockage point, or is this the main blockage point, or is this the main blockage point? And whoever happens to be holding capital at that particular point is the one who really gets hurt. So that's why I sometimes say there's a game of hot potato played in this system historically. And one of the interesting questions right now is who is being hurt by the current crisis, and who is doing okay. And of course some people are doing very well in the current crisis. Workers are being hurt a lot. The suppliers of raw materials are doing very well. Commodity producers are doing very well. The money people here are doing extremely well. The people who are playing around with the financial system are doing pretty well, but all the others are not doing well at all. So this is what I mean by passing the buck around, or playing a game of hot potato with crisis.